And we're back. This is part 2 of 3 videos, Living on Purpose, part 18. As he mentioned, the first thing that's required was a readiness to hear from God. The second thing that's required, as we consider what it means to be confident in the absolute promise of God, is B, a readiness to review the plan of God. And as I mentioned before we ended in our last video, it is important for God's people to be reminded about what God's plan is. That's why we worship. That's why we spend time together in fellowship, so that God can refresh us and renew us, and we need that. Otherwise, we miss his plan. And so Joseph comes to his ailing father Jacob, and Jacob shares with Joseph and reminds him of his calling, his heritage, and his God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the family, and the God of God's chosen people. There's a third thing that we understand here, and that is this: C, a readiness to accept the blessing of God. The promise of God will move us to seek the will of God, which in turn brings us the blessing of God. That's how it works. Unless we seek his will, we will miss his blessing. Did you get that? Unless we seek his will, we will miss his blessing. There are many who have quit seeking the God of their heritage, the God that has saved them and wonderfully provided eternal life for them, and thus they are no longer finding what God has promised them, and in turn are missing his blessing. Now, as you know, God does not force himself on us. But when we come to him and humbly seek him, he will meet with us and bless us. Jacob has a chance to finally meet his grandsons, Joseph's 2 boys, Manasseh and Ephraim. And it tells us in verse 9 that he kissed them and embraced them. It was a time of reunion. It was a time of recognizing the importance of one of the foundations of life, the importance of family. Here's a principle. Living on purpose means being confident in the absolute promise of God, because his promise gives us strength. But there's a second thing that we find as we consider what it means to live on purpose for God, and that is this, number 2. It means being open to the changing plan of God. Being open to the changing plan of God. Now, there are 3 things that we note here that have practical insight for us today regarding the plan of God, which at times will change and then require us to move with it. Here's the first thing. A willingness to listen to what is being said. Now, I want you to notice what happens as we look at the text again. Verse 11 says this. I gotta find my glasses. All right. There we go. Verse 11 says this. Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face again, and now God has revealed me to see your children too. One of the things some of us struggle with is listening. I mean, really listening. We hear, but we don't listen. That's why we sometimes miss what is being said, because our minds are either not focused on what the person is saying to us, or because we have other things on our mind, or we are just not listening at all and paying attention at all. Sometimes we are so preoccupied we do not listen or process what others are saying to us. Now, I speak not one who has accomplished being a good listener. At times I struggle being a good listener. At times I've got to ask my wife Cheryl things that she's told me or asked me that I forgot all about. And it's not that I didn't hear her speaking, I just wasn't focused on what she was saying. As Jacob spoke to Joseph, he reminded him that it was God who made it possible for them to meet again. And Jacob spoke to him as a father relating to his son what is important, especially because of God's plan for them. There's a second thing that we find regarding the changing plan of God, that is this: B, A willingness to do what is required. A willingness to do what is required. As you look at the text, we see that Jacob did something that a lot of Hebrews fathers did as a matter of importance to the family. It is one thing to hear what is being said, but it's a totally different thing than to respond accordingly with a respectful and in a responsible way. Jacob's time would soon be over, and he had to pass to his son Joseph and his grandsons what God had planned and promised for them. And Jacob did what he had planned to do for a long time. It can be compared to a runner's in a race. The most critical time in the race is in the passing of the baton. It had to be done in a specific way, at a specific place in the race, and at just the right way in order to complete the race. Jacob was passing on the baton of God's promised plan to Joseph and his grandsons with the traditional family blessing. He blessed Joseph and then his two grandsons. There's a third thing that we find in here, and that's this. C, a willingness to accept what may not seem right at first. In verses 17 through 20, we see something that took place. And without me reading it, let me just share with you what happened. But before that, let me make a comment here. There will come times when God would have you accept something that is at first does not sit well with you. Sometimes God would have you trust Him with the results and the consequences instead of you trying to make it work out the way you think best. According to ancient tradition, the firstborn son would get the honored right hand of blessing. And Joseph placed his sons in front of their grandfather Jacob so that the firstborn Manasseh was on his right side facing him, and Ephraim, the younger one, on his left side. But what Jacob did, he crossed his arms and gave the right hand of blessing to Ephraim, the youngest one, instead of Manasseh. And Joseph tried to correct this, as we see in verses 17 through 20. The truth is, God knows what is best, and His plan does not have to make sense to us, because after all, He is God, and whatever He does is based on His purpose and His best plan for us. Listen, here's the principle. Living on purpose means being open to the changing plan of God because He knows what is best for us. As Joseph was trying to correct his father Jacob said to him, "Listen, my son, this is how it's going to be. The younger one is going to be greater than the older one." And Joseph had to accept that. Well, this is the second video, Living on Purpose, Part 18, video Part 2 of 3. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.